Hello class, welcome back to another video, another lesson. I hope everyone's doing well. Let's go ahead and get started. So we are working through story of David basically, and his his reign as king of Israel. Um, Up to this point, he's doing a pretty good job, I would say. Uh, but now we're going to look into a pretty big mistake he makes. Yeah, it's not good. Um, and this is important because, you know, two things. First, um, as we've talked about with all the different people who have been leading Israel, from Joshua to the judges like Samson, um, and the kings like Saul and now David, they're all humans who are not perfect, right? They all have weaknesses and they all make some pretty big mistakes, right? And David is no exception to that. Despite that, God makes a covenant. He made a covenant with the Israelites, right? And he's faithful to that covenant and to that promise, and he's going to stick it out with them, right? Um, but David is no exception to the rule. Um, and I feel like, and maybe have gotten this impression too, or maybe not, but sometimes David gets held up as the sort of poster boy for faith and being and what a good, um, a good leader, a good Christian looks like, even though he wasn't Christian, he was a Jew. But anyways, he he sometimes is held as the gold standard, um, and we in the church sometimes really overlook um, this sin he commits, and we're going to talk about it a little bit. And I'm not doing this to say he's not perfect. Ha, that's not the point. Um, the point is again that um, all these people we've been looking at make mistakes, and um, they're not perfect, and they have their weaknesses, but God still works through them, right? God made a covenant with them, and God is faithful despite the faulty and flawed humans. Okay, so let's get into it. So David's great sin. How this story goes: David is kind of hanging out um, in his palace and on his balcony, um, and he's looking outside, and through the window he sees um, a woman named Bathsheba. He sees her bathing, and he's creeping on her. He's kind of staring at her, and um, the sort of sinful word for this we could use is lust, and it turns into adultery. Um, David sleeps with her and gets her pregnant. Um, Sometimes we in the church really gloss over this story and just make it sound like infidelity. But when you read the story and you really look at the details, this is rape. Okay, David rapes Bathsheba. Um, this is obviously a big deal, and part of the reason why I feel the need to call it for what it is um, even in our own sort of modern culture, we see the same thing happen where um, we, when there's instances of sexual assault in the news, right, we don't want to call it for what it is. It's rape and it's wrong, right? We should do the same or we shouldn't do the same when we see this in the Bible, right? David raped Bathsheba, and that is wrong, right? So that's what happens. And, I and sort of going to apologize, because I understand this is kind of sensitive, um, and um, this can be a trigger for some people. So please, um, take care of yourselves. And if this is like a serious problem, sitting in and listening to this, just email me and we'll talk through this, okay? But that's it as far as the sort of sexual assault part, okay? So David, instead of owning up to his mistake, he tries to cover it up. All right. David then tries to trick Uriah. So Uriah is the husband of Bathsheba. Um, David tries to trick him into sleeping with his own wife, Bathsheba, to cover up the pregnancy. So again, David got Bathsheba pregnant, and so David's trying to cover that up by tricking Bathsheba's own husband into sleeping with her. Um, and he's doing this by trying to get him super drunk so he'll sleep with her. Um, there's like a battle going on, and Uriah doesn't want to leave the battle. So it's kind of complicated, but suffice it to say, David is trying to cover up his mistake. And when that doesn't work, he has him killed. He has him killed by placing him in the front lines in battle. Okay? And this is kind of a sneaky way of killing him. He doesn't just directly say, have Uriah killed. He says, place him in the front lines. He's sure to, die that way. You have to think ancient warfare. The front lines of those battles was not a place he'd wanted to be, right? So he dies, and then David marries Bathsheba. Not an ideal way to start a marriage, no. So that's David's great sin. For your first private comment, please, in just one sentence, tell me what is it that he did, and then how did he try to cover it up? All right. So you pause the video, type that out, and then come back to it. Okay. So before we move on, let me set something up first. So Samuel, we talked about yesterday. Samuel's been dead for a while, but there is a new prophet now, and his name is Nathan. Okay. So God is kind of telling Nathan about what David just did, and so God tells Nathan to go to David, and Nathan comes to David, and he has sort of a parable for him, and this is what it says. There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the one little lamb that had belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David, when he heard this, he burned with anger against the man in the story, and he said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." Then Nathan said to David, "You are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all of Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" You struck down Uriah with a sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. So Nathan's kind of dropping a hammer on David, telling him, through this story of this parable, well, this parable's about you, buddy, and you messed up. So the prophet Nathan helps David to see how horrible his actions were with the parable, the story of a poor man and his lamb. David comes around and he repents, and sadly, that baby died. The baby that David and Bathsheba had, he dies. But then they have a second child, and his name is Solomon, which might sound familiar to some of you. Solomon will be the next king of Israel. Okay? So that is it for today's video and today's lesson. There was one private comment involved, so make sure you got that, and that is it for this video. I believe there are further instructions of what to do when you are done, so make sure you check that out, and I'll see you later. Bye.